so many of the people that are so virulently anti-Russian today were those who grew up all throughout the Cold War and are still stuck in that mentality. But you grew up in that same world, and yet you adjusted and changed with the changing of the times and the changing of the other side as well, to have an open mind instead of one that is closed back and formed in the 70s and 80s. So I want to play a clip from the Tucker Carlson interview with Putin, where he makes a number of claims. I would really like your view as a diplomat who is skilled at knowing what leaders and people say in public and what maybe it means in the background for possibility for diplomatic negotiations.
I mean, have you achieved your aims?
No, we haven't achieved our aims yet, because one of them is denazification.
I think what you're saying is you want to extinguish or at least control Ukrainian nationalism, but how? How do you do that?
This question appears to be subtle. It is quite pesky. You say Hitler has been dead for so many years, 80 years. But his example lives on. People who exterminated Jews, Russians, and Poles are alive. And the president, the current president of today's Ukraine, applauds him in the Canadian Parliament, gives a standing ovation. Can we say that we have completely uprooted this ideology if what we see is happening today?
You don't control the entire country. You don't control Kiev. You don't seem like you want to. So how do you eliminate a culture or an ideology or feelings or a view of history in a country that you don't control? What do you do about that?
We have it all in writing. Neo-Nazism would not be cultivated in Ukraine, including that it would be prohibited at the legislative level. This, it turns out, can be done during the negotiation process. Is any state allowed to promote Nazism? It is not, is it? That is it.
One of the things that really stood out to me about that was at the end of it, Putin specifically said that denazification, that can be discussed in negotiations, which, along with other things he said in that interview, make it sound like he's very much potentially open to negotiated end as opposed to winning militarily. What do you think is actually possible behind the scenes diplomatically?
Well, I think there were a number of interesting elements to that. First of all, this war began not when Putin refused to negotiate. He demanded a negotiation, and he demonstrated his seriousness by massing troops on the border with Ukraine. And it was the United States, Secretary of State Blinken, President Biden, who said there can be no negotiation with you. And when we stiff-armed him, he acted militarily, which we knew he was going to do because we were predicting it. So this business of he won't negotiate is nonsense. And it's even more clear that it's nonsense because he did negotiate under the auspices of the Turkish government and with the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. His representatives and the Ukrainians reached a treaty draft. They got an agreement. He just cited part of it, which was that the Ukrainians would not allow the extreme fascist element in their society to predominate. So he proved that he would negotiate. But I think probably the most interesting thing about that statement is that he has not yet moved the goalposts. He is sticking with his original declared objectives so far. But as things change on the battlefield, as the Russians cease to operate a meat grinder against Ukrainian human wave tactics favored by the new defense minister of Ukraine, apparently, and begin to go on the offensive themselves across the broad division between their troops and the Ukrainians, the situation is going to deteriorate from Ukraine's point of view. And they've run out of manpower. They have internal divisions now, which are very obvious. No one knows how long Mr. Zelensky will remain in power. And he's apparently bought a $17 million apartment in Dubai to add to his mother's villa on the Red Sea and his villa in Tuscany, and God knows what other properties he has abroad. He's got a bolt hole. I'm not predicting he will use it, but it's clear that there is a lot of disorder in Kyiv at the moment.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Putin is not talking about dominating Ukraine. He's still talking about neutralizing it. And he made that quite clear in that conversation with Tucker Carlson. But the question now is, at what point will he feel that he's entitled to move the goalposts? And those goalposts have, not included seizing what was once part of Russia, namely the area around Odessa, and depriving Ukraine of the Black Sea coast that it has had.
Yeah.
since 1922, when Lenin gave that land to the new Ukrainian state within the Soviet Union. I think we're at a very difficult moment. And I note that his statement that he wanted to negotiate was immediately rebuffed by the White House. There's no point in negotiating with him. You said it. You can't trust anything he says. I think, on the contrary, I'm sure he is a very manipulative, cynical person, formed as I was in the Cold War. But I see no evidence that he doesn't keep his word.